So I saw this video being passed around recently. Some goth guy who calls himself Morgue and paints his face, which is a clear indication that he's a well-adjusted human being grounded in reality, and he's claiming that science is the new irrational religion, and I just couldn't pass up the bait.
People generally think that science is all about truth, but as we'll show in this video, it is nowhere near the truth, and its explanations about your existence and your purpose are just as absurd as mainstream religion.
Wait, hold up a sec. When did science ever make any claims about your purpose? The idea of purpose is outside of the realm of science. That's more of a philosophical quandary to which existentialist nihilism seems to be the logical conclusion.
Every era thinks that they have it all figured out, and the ideas of the past were crazy. Those born in the early ages of humanity thought that their primitive stories about creation were true, and those born in the Christian era thought that their religious ideas were true, and most born today think that scientific materialism is true. But in actuality, the people of the future will look back on scientific materialism as a primitive and childish view of reality.
This is just an appeal to past practice, or the failure of such. Just because people in the past were wrong in their beliefs doesn't say anything about the validity of science or the beliefs of today. And of course the explanations of the past seem crazy to us. They didn't have science yet! And although I agree that people of the future will see our beliefs as primitive and faulty, I concur for completely different reasons. They might laugh at how little we know and the conclusions we came to, but the scientific method itself isn't the problem. And physicalism, or scientific materialism as you call it, isn't an issue either. A holographic quantum universe made up of wavelengths may not be physical by our standard, but it is still encompassed within the idea of physicalism. So what about the universe, and what we know about it thus far, suggests anything beyond scientific materialism? Because to suggest otherwise is to believe in the supernatural.
Don't get trapped by the consciousness of the era that you were born into.
Yeah, don't get fooled by the zeitgeist. Let this spooky clown tell you how the universe works. Because clearly spooky clowns on the internet know more than professional scientists. We don't adhere to science simply because it's the way of our era. We do because it gets results.
In 100 years, science will look nothing like it does today. So if you are really looking for truth, then have an open mind and weigh everything we are about to say with logic and reason.
Fuck you!
You see, people assume that scientific materialism is rational. However, that is blatantly incorrect.
Well, clearly this guy is super rational. He's got no fucking eyebrows. He's on a whole other level than us eyebrowed scumfucks. I can't be held to the same kind of standard with all this hair above my eyes.
Our system, Hyperionism, is mathematical, rationalist, and deductive, while science is about sense data, empiricism, and induction.
Wait, you can't just covet rationalism and math. Those are still very much a part of science.
Science is an empirical system, which is opposed to rationalism. This can't be stressed enough. Science is not about reason. Science is about empiricism.
Well, they aren't in total juxtaposition to one another. In fact, one could argue that rationalists get their opening data from empirical experiences, and that empirical findings are driven by rationalist thought. So they're somewhat symbiotic. To say that reason isn't a part of science is what's truly absurd here. We use reason to formulate hypotheses, and then we use empiricism to verify it. Then we use reason again to rationalize the results.
The definition of empiricism is the doctrine that all knowledge is derived from sense experience, whereas rationalism is the doctrine that all knowledge is based on reason and not on religious faith or sense experience.
Well, that right there is why rationalism by itself is faulty and needs empiricism to back it up. It seems to me that this guy's whole premise is that the Socratic method is somehow superior to the scientific method. The quality of your reasoning is directly related to the quality of your thought, and not everybody has the cognitive abilities necessary. And I'd go as far as to say that there is no human, alive or dead, that could or ever will be so rational that their ponderance alone would be sufficient evidence of reality. Just because something stands to reason doesn't mean it's true, and there's no way to verify it's true with reason alone.
These two views are opposite, and never forget, that science is an empirical system, not a rational system. Furthermore, science is inductive, whereas our system is deductive. Deduction is a method of reasoning that guarantees 100% that the conclusion is true no matter what.
That's not 100% true at all, Star Child. First off, I'd argue that deductive and inductive reasoning are just two sides of the same fucking coin. Secondly, as I said before, the validity of your conclusions is in direct relation to the quality of your logic and your wealth of knowledge. And since no person is infallible or omniscient, then there's no assurance that deductive conclusions will always be 100% true. If this was the case, deductive reasoning would have answered all of life's questions a long-ass time ago.
While induction is a method based on repeated tests that only ever gives a probability of something being true. No matter how good the inductive test is, it always has the probability of being wrong.
What you're touting as induction's biggest flaw is in fact its greatest strength. It's a self-correcting open door. There is no closed world assumption. There are no declarations of truth based on logical fallacies. There is just probability based on evidence. And the only way to gather that evidence is through sense data. I can sit around contemplating who killed Tupac all fucking day. I'm never going to get any concrete answers from that, just because my conclusions are based on things I believe to be reasonable.
Deduction is about guaranteed truth, while induction only gives a probability of being true. For example, classical mechanics was once considered to be absolutely true, and you were considered crazy by the scientific establishment if you thought otherwise. However, today it is known that classical mechanics is completely and utterly false. It's been replaced by quantum mechanics.
What? Coming in on the right. What? What the fuck are you talking about? Classical mechanics isn't false, and it wasn't replaced by quantum mechanics. Newtonian mechanics is still true for the macro world that we interact with, and quantum mechanics simply supplements it by explaining the behavior of things at a subatomic level. And we still barely know shit about quantum physics. Not only is this a terrible example, but even if it were true, it's nothing more than an anecdote and doesn't add to your argument. You know how in the past, this one thing was true and now it isn't? Well, this is the same, just take my word for it.
Now, understand what we're saying. Science has been great at coming up with advances in technology and medicine, and that's wonderful. But just because science comes up with material inventions does not mean that they know the truth about reality. That is a huge logical fallacy. And fallacies are everywhere. For example, if a person prayed to God for someone that was sick to get better, and they did get better, it does not mean that it was because of the prayer. And just because science can come up with smartphones and smart pads does not mean that they know anything about the underlying nature of reality.
No, that is not an apt comparison, Ziggy Stardust. The reason science can produce so much in such a short time is because it has an accurate understanding of the physical world. If it didn't, the shit wouldn't work. Like things produced before science, like divining rods and astrology, and they don't fucking work? It's a pretty safe assumption, really.
In fact, classical mechanics is responsible for all of these advances, and even getting people to the moon. But it is a fact that classical mechanics is 100% wrong, and it has been completely refuted and replaced by quantum mechanics. Even though classical mechanics is definitely incorrect, it can still create the technology to put a person on the moon.
Do you not know what a fact is? When your eyebrows left, did they take that knowledge with them? Force is mass times acceleration, the second law of motion in classical mechanics. That's still true after the discovery of quantum mechanics. The fact we got people to the moon is evidence that it's not incorrect.
Material success does not equal truth. Scientists like to pretend that they're on the side of logic and reason, when the opposite is true. They put their faith in the senses and are just as dogmatic about it as a mainstream religious person.
No. Just no. There's not even close to the same thing. Having faith means belief without evidence. If I'm given a sufficient body of evidence, I am no longer acting on faith. It seems to me that this cut-rate pseudo-intellectual Marilyn Manson is dealing in the semantics of knowledge. Since we can't actually know anything aside from what we can observe using sense data, it's impossible to truly know anything by that standard. And if that's the case, then everything is taken on faith and the idea becomes fucking moot.
Mainstream religion argues their position based on faith, whereas scientific materialism argues their position based on sensory data. Both faith and sense data are opposed to the rational and logical method.
You can claim your Hyperionism is rational, but it's far from logical. If I had to choose between the conclusions drawn from scientists running tests with equipment that bolsters their sense data, or a room full of homeless philosophers staring at the ground in thought, I think I'm going to go with the empiricists on that one.
Max Planck, the famous physicist and who was the originator of quantum theory, said, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Science progresses one funeral at a time."
The context of that quote is an indictment of human nature and not science. It's about how people are so resistant to ideas that they need to die to make way for it. But seeing as we're quoting Max Planck, here's a good one for you. Experiments are the only means of knowledge at our disposal. The rest is poetry, imagination.
Don't believe the lie that scientists are on the side of logic and reason. They are on the side of empirical data, on fallible sense data. Sense data once said that classical mechanics was correct, even though it's now known to be 100% wrong. Bias and stubbornness is just as present in scientific materialism as anywhere else. It's only once they're dead and gone that a new path is cleared for new ideas. That is why science can't come up with a theory for everything.
Really? You think that's the reason? I must disagree. I think science will come up with a unified theory, and the only reason we haven't yet is because science has only been around for a few centuries, and that's a blink of an eye in human history.
If they got rid of their fallacious belief system and replaced it with a mathematical system of logic and reason, they would have a final theory of everything within 10 years.
First of all, science already utilizes math. My low math scores are why I never went into a career in physics. Why do you keep presenting this as though using mathematics just never occurred to them? Math has an incredible accuracy in predictions. That's probably the only logical thing you proposed, and they already beat you to it.
Another huge misconception about science is that it has most things figured out about the world, and that there are just a few things left to get right. Nothing could be further from the truth.
How the fuck would you know? Unless you're somehow aware of the total sum of knowledge in the universe, how could you know how much or how little of it we actually know? Although I do concede we probably only scratched the surface, science still knows more than this guy ever will.
Think about this carefully. Let's say you just entered this universe for the first time, and you're trying to figure out what reality is. So you look at a table and you ask, "What is a table?" And the person might reply, "Well, a table is made out of wood." Now, has that really answered your question?
Well, no, I asked what a table was, not what it's made from, but go on.
Of course not. You would have to know what wood is first, or else you're just trading words around. So if you ask, "Well, what is wood?" then you get the answer, "Well, wood is a composite of molecules." But of course, you don't know what molecules are.
Wow, people from other universes are fucking stupid.
So you ask, "Well, what are molecules?" Molecules are composed of atoms. What are atoms? Atoms are composed of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Well, what are electrons, protons, and neutrons? Well, electrons are fundamental particles, and the protons and neutrons, they're composed of fundamental particles too. Okay, so what are fundamental particles? No idea. That's right. Fundamental particles, what they actually are, is completely and totally unknown by science.
And you, bud! It's also completely unknown by you, and everyone else that ever lived. Wavelengths was the answer you were looking for, by the way. As I said before, science is relatively new, so to expect it to have all the answers already is ludicrous. But just because it doesn't know something yet doesn't mean it's unknowable, or that our body of knowledge is invalid. And it certainly doesn't mean you get to inject any half-wit theory into that gap. I'm gonna cut the video short. He basically just repeats himself ad nauseum and spouts out some more irrelevant mathematics. So I'll spare your ears from his nonsense and your eyes from the blown-out white contrast of his face against a Vanta black backdrop. And he looks kind of familiar, too. Is it possible that he's the freak show street performer for Venice Beach, also named Morgue? Huh. I guess unlocking the secrets of the universe with Hyperionism isn't as lucrative as putting a hook in your face for spare change.